September 19, 1944, 11:03 a.m. near Erord, France. Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson crouched low inside the turret of his M4 Sherman, sweat running down his back despite the morning chill. The steel around him vibrated softly as the tank's engine idled. Outside, the French countryside was quiet, too quiet. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, 47 German Panther tanks were on the move. Thompson was 24. He'd been in combat for months. This was his 13th tank engagement. Odds were, he wouldn't make it to 14. Beside him, Sergeant William Crawford, the gunner, adjusted his controls with practiced urgency. Thompson had been loading for Crawford since Normandy. In all that time, the outcome of every engagement came down to the same cruel math. Whoever saw the enemy first lived longer. The Sherman's narrow gunner sight gave Crawford just 30 degrees of vision. By the time their commander shouted a direction and Crawford rotated the turret, the German gunner had already locked in. Sometimes, they were dead before the gun could even elevate. The 4th Armored Division had already lost 23 Shermans in 3 weeks. Thompson had lost 2 friends. The first was Corporal David Kozlowski, September 7th, Chicago steel mill worker, trained with Thompson at Fort Knox. A Panther spotted them from 1,300 yards, hidden in a tree line. One round, that was all it took. It punched through the turret like paper. The propellant charges ignited. Kozlowski, loading a shell, didn't have time to scream. He burned inside that tank for 3 hours. Then came Martinez. Corporal James Martinez, Thompson's best friend. Survived the hedgerows of Normandy, talked about opening a garage together after the war. On September 16th, his Sherman engaged 3 Panthers near Bison-La. They knocked out one. Then a second Panther flanked them, 900 yards out. The round came from the side, went straight through the turret. Martinez was pulling a shell from the rack. The round hit him mid-motion, dead before he hit the floor. 2 days later, Martinez's tank commander found Thompson in the motor pool. He was shaking. Told him if they'd seen that Panther just 3 seconds earlier, Martinez would still be alive. Then he broke down crying. Thompson didn't blame him. He didn't blame Crawford either. They were all doing the best they could. But the truth was brutal. American tankers were brave. They just couldn't see. The Panthers had better optics, better camouflage. The Sherman's 75mm gun could kill a Panther. That wasn't the problem. The problem was spotting the target before it spotted you. Thompson started studying it, the pattern of how Shermans died. Same story every time. The Panther sees first, fires first, hits first. Sometimes the crew got out. Most times, they didn't. By mid-September, Thompson had watched 11 loaders die. All of them killed because the gunner couldn't see the threat in time. So Thompson started thinking, how do I give Crawford more eyes? How do I break that pattern? The answer came on September 18th. Simple. Crude. Perfect. A mirror. 3 by 4 inches. Standard issue. From his own shaving kit. September 18th, 1944, Lorraine, France. After 2,200 hours. The motor pool was quiet now. Most crews were asleep. Only the faint hum of distant generators and the chirr of insects broke the silence. Cool air drifted in from the hills. The scent of oil, diesel, and worn steel hung over everything. Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson moved through the shadows with purpose. He carried a canvas tool bag. Inside, wire cutters, pliers, salvaged steel wire from destroyed equipment, a half-dead flashlight, and a 3x4-inch mirror, standard issue, taken from his shaving kit that morning. It might save their lives. The Sherman sat in the line, 50 yards away, hulking in the dark like a sleeping animal. No guards, no one watching. Night maintenance was common. Nobody would question a loader climbing into his own tank. Thompson opened the loader's hatch, slid inside. The metal was cold. The flashlight beam jumped across familiar contours. Ammo racks, elevation controls, the heavy breech of the 75mm, the worn leather of the gunner's seat. That's where Crawford would sit tomorrow. That's where men had died. Thompson moved carefully, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. What he had to do. Modifying a combat vehicle without orders was a court-martial offense. Destruction of government property. Unauthorized alteration. Minimum penalty, rank reduction. Maximum, prison. But he didn't care. Because Martinez was dead. Kozlowski was dead. 11 loaders were dead. He wasn't going to be number 12. He held the mirror up beside the gunner's seat. Tried different angles. Too high, and Crawford couldn't see it while aiming. Too low, and it would block his movement. It had to be perfect. A position where Crawford could glance left, without lifting his eye from the gun's sight, and catch movement behind the tank. A sliver of vision. A warning. 3 seconds of foreknowledge. Just enough to live. He marked the spot, 12 inches left of the gunner's station, angled precisely 45 degrees. He bent 4 6-inch pieces of steel wire into U-shaped brackets, held them up, drilled mounting holes using a hand crank drill. The bit squealed against the inner turret wall, loud in the silence. Every 10 seconds he stopped, listened, held his breath. Nobody came. His fingers slipped on the cold metal. The flashlight rolled away twice. The pliers dropped once, clattering against the hull. He froze each time, heart hammering, sure he'd be caught. But no boots approached. After 40 minutes, the brackets were installed. Thompson mounted the mirror, tightened the wire, adjusted the angle with his thumb. Then he sat back on the ammo crate and stared at it. Not just the mirror, but what it meant. They might still die tomorrow. But now Crawford would see the death coming. A flicker in the mirror. A shadow in the trees. 3 seconds. Maybe enough. September 19th, 1944, 0130 hours. Lorraine, France. Tomorrow, Frank Thompson would either be loading shells or burning alive inside this turret. The mirror was mounted. Crude. Illegal. But it worked. 3 seconds. That's what it might buy them. 3 seconds to see a panther before it fired. 3 seconds to traverse the turret. 3 seconds to survive. He twisted the wire tight around the brackets. The mirror held firm. No rattle. No slip. He sat in Crawford's seat, stared down the main gun sight. Then glanced left. There it was, clear as day. The view behind the tank, framed in dull metal. A slit of visibility no Sherman gunner had ever been given. The forward sight and the mirror together. A battlefield widened by inches. A battlefield they might live through. Thompson cleaned up, collected the wire scraps, brushed away the metal shavings with an oily rag. The mirror didn't belong. It looked like what it was, a desperate, homemade fix. But the turret was cluttered. Radios, extinguishers, shell racks, wiring. One small mirror might go unnoticed. Or it might not. He didn't care. At 0130, he climbed out. The sky was moonless. Stars above like ice. He walked back to his cot and lay there in the dark, boots still on. He didn't sleep. He stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent and thought about the hours ahead. The 4th Armored Division was moving at 0700. Intel said there were Panthers nearby. 47 of them. The 5th Panzer Army was out there, somewhere to the east, trying to stop Patton's advance toward the German border. Tomorrow would be a tank battle, one of hundreds across France. But for Thompson, it came down to one thing. Would Crawford see the enemy 3 seconds sooner? Would they shoot first? Or would Thompson end up like Martinez, like Kozlowski, like the 11 loaders he couldn't forget? No middle ground in armored combat. You shot first, or you died in fire. September 19th, 1944, 0615 hours. Engines roared across the staging area. Exhaust clouds hung low in the morning mist. Sherman tanks idled in lines, steel beasts waking up. Mechanics shouted. Crewmen ran final checks. Radios crackled. Thompson tightened the strap on his helmet, pulled his gloves on, slid into the loader's seat one last time. At 0712, their Sherman rolled out of the motor pool, clanking over gravel, then onto hard-packed dirt. The 75mm gun pointed forward. The steel tracks groaned beneath 30 tons of armor. Thompson sat beside the breech, surrounded by 76 rounds of ammunition. Armor-piercing, high-explosive, white phosphorus. Familiar shapes. Familiar weight. He'd loaded these shells hundreds of times. Today might be the last time. To his right, Crawford settled into the gunner's seat. Above them, the tank commander stood in the open cupola, scanning the terrain. The driver and assistant driver were sealed forward in the hull. 5 men. 1 tank. 12 miles east, the enemy was waiting. Thompson glanced at the mirror. 3 seconds. That's all it had to give. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. September 19th, 1944, 0907 hours. Northeast of Erort, France. The 4th Armored rolled east in column formation. 18 Shermans spread across 2 miles of French farmland. Golden fields on both sides. Distant treelines like jagged teeth. Low ridges to the north, rolling hills beyond. It was perfect ambush country. Panther country. Thompson sat hunched beside the breach, watching Crawford through the smoke haze. The mirror, his mirror, was there. 12 inches to Crawford's left. Angled just right. Still, not a word from the gunner. No comment. No glance. Either he hadn't noticed it, or he had, and he didn't care. The tank rocked slightly as it crested a rise. Then the radio crackled to life. Movement ahead. 6 Panthers. Bearing northeast. Range 2,000 yards. Too far for a clean shot. The battalion commander's voice followed, sharp and practiced. All tanks, fan out. Find hull down. Prepare to engage. Thompson's crew peeled off to the right, treads churning soil, settling behind a low ridge. Partial cover, a slit of protection. Enough. The tank commander stood in the cupola, binoculars raised. Gunner, eyes front. Use the rise. Wait for them to close. Crawford nodded. Traversed the turret. Slow, methodical. The 75 millimeters pointed east over the fields. Nothing yet. No movement. No silhouettes. The Panthers were waiting, too. Cunning, disciplined, trained to ambush, not to charge. Thompson rammed an armor-piercing round into the breach. Slammed it shut. Metal rang in the turret. He tapped Crawford's shoulder. Ready. His palms were sweating inside his gloves. His heartbeat pulsed in his ears. This was it. The moment. Either the mirror would matter, or he'd drilled holes in army steel for nothing. 0907. The Sherman fired. Recoil slammed through the tank. The breach kicked open. Spent brass shot out, spinning hot. Turret filled with cordite smoke. Thompson grabbed the next round. Another AP shell. He shoved it in, locked the breach. 6 seconds. That's all it took. Crawford was already swinging the turret right, scanning. Then, Panther. Left rear. 800 yards. Calm. Precise. No panic. Thompson froze. Left rear. A flanker. A Panther had maneuvered behind them, slipped through the trees, curved around the company, was moving to strike them from the side. The Sherman's weakest armor. A 75 millimeters round from that angle would cut the tank in half. It would be over in seconds. But Crawford had seen it. Not from the commander. Not from radio. He hadn't needed to rotate the turret or guess. He'd looked at the mirror. He'd seen the Panther in the reflection, alone, moving fast across open ground, exposed. Thompson's lungs locked as the turret shrieked left. Metal grinding. Windup of gears. He jammed another AP round into the gun. Slammed the breech shut. Through the side port, he caught a glimpse. Massive turret, sloped armor, thick cross on the hull. The Panther. It was closing in. Wide open. Thompson shook his head. Nothing, he said. Just don't die. Hayes looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. No salute, no handshake, just understanding. In war, that was enough. The next night, Thompson installed 2 more mirrors. Then 4. By the end of the week, 11 Shermans in the battalion had them. Each one hand-drilled. Each one held together with scrap wire. Each one a silent rebellion against the rules that kept getting good men killed. No one officially approved the modifications. No officer ever asked where the mirrors came from. But word spread. Crews started calling them Thompson glass. Gunner after gunner reported spotting threats seconds earlier. Crawford's kill was just the first of many. And the difference showed. In October, the battalion entered heavy combat again, near the German border. Panther sightings were constant. But the kill ratio shifted. Shermans were spotting first. Shooting first. Surviving. By December, Thompson's name was known across the 4th Armored Division. Not in the newspapers, not in the official reports, but in the way tank commanders would quietly ask, "Is this one fitted?" before a fight. It wasn't recognition he wanted. He didn't care. He just didn't want to see another loader die reaching for a shell they never got to fire. He never told command. Never asked permission. Just mirrors. Just seconds. Just survival. Years later, after the war, when Sherman veterans were asked what saved them in tank duels where the enemy had better optics, some would smile and say, "A mirror. That's all. A little piece of glass that saw what we couldn't." And most never knew his name. But the ones who lived because of that mirror never forgot it. Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson. The man who saw the dead, learned, and refused to be next. Abrams stared at the mirror. said nothing, just sat there for a long moment, eyes tracing the wire, the crude brackets, the scratched surface of the government issue glass. Then he looked at Crawford, then at Thompson. You boys really see with this? Crawford nodded. Yes, sir. 3 seconds early, every time. Abrams leaned back, still quiet. Then he said the last thing Thompson expected to hear. Install one in every tank. No court-martial. No reprimand. No lecture about regulations. Just a single order from a combat commander who understood that survival came first. Thompson exhaled. His shoulders dropped. Crawford gave him the smallest nod, like a promise had been kept. That night, Thompson didn't sneak into the motor pool. He walked in through the front, toolbox in hand, fully authorized. That week, he and a few trusted loaders installed mirrors in 31 more Shermans. By October, it was standard in the battalion. By November, the modification had spread to the entire division. Nobody called it illegal anymore. They called it Thompson's sight. And somewhere near Moncourt, a scared 18-year-old loader sat in a turret, staring at a scratched, shaving mirror bolted to the wall, knowing he might just live through the day because a dead man's friend refused to follow the rules. By mid-October, the mirror modification was spreading through the entire Third Army. Nobody issued a formal directive. There was no memo from headquarters. No official supply order. Just tankers talking to tankers. Mechanics showing other mechanics. Men who'd seen too many friends die suddenly doing whatever it took to stay alive. Thompson became a kind of legend in the motor pool. Not because he was a hero. Not because he gave speeches. But because he'd looked at a problem, loaders dying one after another, and refused to accept it. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for an engineer in some office to design a fix. He took a mirror from his shaving kit, drilled holes in a Sherman turret, and gave his gunner 3 seconds of warning. Those 3 seconds saved dozens of lives. In late October, General Patton himself visited the 4th Armored Division. He inspected tanks, shook hands with crewmen, praised the battalion's kill ratios. When he stepped into one of the Shermans, he spotted the mirror, studied it for a moment, then turned to Abrams. What the hell is this? Local modification, sir, Abrams replied. Tested in combat. It works. Patton grunted, nodded once. Tell your men to keep doing whatever wins. He didn't ask about regulations. He didn't ask about paperwork. He saw a practical solution in action. That was enough. Over the next few months, the mirrors kept saving lives. American tank crews across Europe began adding them. Different sizes, different placements, some crude, some polished, but all inspired by Thompson's original. After the war, the Army never officially recognized the modification, but veterans remembered. In reunions and memoirs, old tankers told stories about those little mirrors. Some still had theirs, packed away in footlockers. Bent, scratched, smoke-stained. Some even brought them home. In 1983, at a 4th Armored reunion, a retired sergeant named Crawford gave a short toast. He held up a 3x4-inch shaving mirror in a worn metal frame and said, "This saved my life in 1944. Because one man decided to break the rules and do the right thing." The room went silent. Then 300 old soldiers stood and raised their glasses. To Thompson, to the mirror, to the 3 seconds that meant the difference between going home and dying in a burning turret. And none of it had started with a general's order, a factory blueprint, or a field manual update. It had started with one man, a 24-year-old loader in a Sherman turret, holding a shaving mirror in his hand and thinking, there has to be a way. Frank Thompson never received a medal for the mirror. No commendation, no ceremony, no official recognition in Army records. But among tankers, his name traveled quietly from crew to crew. They called it Thompson's glass or the loader's eye. Even decades later, veterans who fought in France and Germany would mention it in memoirs and interviews. They'd recall drilling holes in the turret wall, wiring a mirror in place, testing the angle under red light before dawn. They'd talk about the moment it gave them, a glimpse, a shadow, a reflection of a panther creeping along a hedgerow, and how that moment let them shout, "Traverse left," before it was too late. In a war of industrial scale, of grand strategy and sweeping offensives, it was one of the smallest battlefield innovations, and one of the most effective. No factories had to retool. No generals had to rethink doctrine. It didn't come from a top-secret lab in the States. It came from a shaving kit. One mirror. 3 seconds. hundreds of lives. And the man who gave those seconds to a whole army didn't ask for anything in return. Just this: don't get killed. But the tankers knew the truth. They knew it wasn't engineers in clean uniforms or office chairs in Washington who had found the answer. It was a kid with grease on his sleeves and fire in his memory. A loader who had watched his friends burn alive. A soldier who drilled holes in steel in the middle of the night. Not for glory, not for orders, but because he refused to die for someone else's design flaw. The men who mattered, the ones who fought, who loaded shells, who stared through gun sights waiting for that first flash of movement. They remembered. When new crews arrived, veterans told them the story. How one mirror saved 5 tanks outside Erort. How the mirror was installed illegally. How it spread through the whole battalion before the brass even noticed. They said the same thing every time. This didn't come from the top. It came from Frank Thompson. For the rest of the war, every time a Panther was spotted in a mirror before it fired, Thompson's name lived on in that brief second of warning. It didn't need a footnote in an official Army report. It didn't need a medal or a citation. It was etched in every tank crewman's muscle memory. Glance left, check the mirror, stay alive. And long after the tanks were decommissioned and the war was over, the memory remained. One man, one mirror, 3 seconds. That's all it took to change the odds. That's all it took to rewrite survival. The Army might have claimed the invention, but the men who lived because of it, they remembered who really saved them. Thompson survived too. He had 37 tank engagements under his belt. He'd loaded over 1,400 shells. Armor-piercing, high-explosive, white phosphorus. Each one a chance to live. Each one a fraction of a second from death. In every battle, he sat shoulder to shoulder with fire and fate, and each time, the mirror gave them just enough to tip the scale. He went home to Kansas. Quiet town. Quiet life. Took a job at a machine shop. Never talked much about the war. When people asked, he just said he was a loader. That was true. He didn't mention the mirror. Didn't mention the 40-minute modification that spread across the entire U.S. Armored force in Europe. Didn't mention the crews who were alive because of what he'd done. Years passed. Then decades. In 1972, a military historian researching armored warfare came across the original reports from the 4th Armored Division, buried documents with notes from Lieutenant Colonel Abrams detailing the mirror innovation. The historian tracked down veterans, spoke to surviving tankers, heard the same name over and over: Thompson, the loader who installed the first mirror, the one who kept doing it, night after night. No orders, no rewards, just a kid trying to keep his friends alive. The historian published an article, The Mirror in the Turret: How One Illegal Field Modification Changed U.S. Tank Warfare. It got little attention outside of academic circles. No medals followed. No posthumous honors. But tank veterans read it. They sent letters. Called each other. Remembered the story. Some said Thompson deserved a monument. Others said he didn't need one. Because every tanker who saw a Panther in the mirror and lived was already a living monument to him. And every time a loader climbed into a turret and noticed a small, angled mirror bolted near the gunner's sight, it wasn't just equipment. It was legacy. A silent nod to the man who gave them 3 seconds. 3 seconds to see. 3 seconds to shoot. 3 seconds to live. That historian's name was David Ralston, a former Marine turned academic who was piecing together how small battlefield innovations had shifted outcomes in World War II. When he found repeated mentions of gunner mirrors in the 1944 logs, always described as unofficial, field-installed, or unauthorized, his curiosity deepened. The names that surfaced again and again in the margins weren't engineers or officers, but loaders. One name appeared more than any other: Thompson. Ralston tracked it down. Frank Thompson, Pennsylvania. Still alive. Retired. He called the house. Thompson's wife answered. Said Frank was in the garage. Ralston asked if he could speak with him. When Thompson came to the phone, his voice was dry, skeptical. He didn't know why a historian would want to talk to an old loader. Ralston told him what he'd found. The records. The reports. The logs. The interviews with surviving tankers. How the mirrors had spread from tank to tank. How they had saved lives. How Abrams had tried to credit him, but was buried by bureaucracy. There was a long silence on the line. Then Thompson said, quietly, "It was just a mirror." Ralston flew out a week later. He sat with Thompson at the kitchen table. Thompson brought out a faded photo, 5 men standing beside a Sherman. Grease-streaked, grinning, exhausted. Thompson pointed them out. Crawford, Hayes, me. Rest are gone. He didn't want to be interviewed. He didn't want a book. But Ralston took notes anyway. When he asked why Thompson never told anyone, Thompson shrugged. They made it official. That was enough. Ralston published an article in Military Review in 1994. 3 seconds. The unofficial mirror that changed tank warfare. The story spread quietly at first. Then a journalist picked it up. Then a documentary crew. Veterans started writing in. Tank crews from Desert Storm talked about how even in the M1 Abrams, awareness of flanking threats was still life or death. Military historians began including Thompson's mirror in lectures on field innovation. It became a case study in West Point classes. Frank Thompson never gave a speech, never sat for a camera, but in 1995, the U.S. Army sent him a plaque. It wasn't much, just a polished wood square with a metal engraving. To Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson, Loader, 4th Armored Division, whose field modification saved lives and changed armored tactics. September 1944, Era, France. Thompson hung it in his garage, next to his workbench, above a shelf of tools. He died in 2003. The obituary said, Army veteran, steelworker, father of 2. But every year, on September 19th, Crawford still called Thompson's daughters, still thanked them for what their father had done. And somewhere, in tank museums across the country, visitors walk past restored Shermans with tiny mirrors mounted inside the turrets. Most don't notice them, but a few do. And when they ask, a docent might smile and say, that wasn't standard issue. That started with a loader named Thompson. They remember the generals. They remember the medals. But they never remember the men who kept us alive. Thompson just nodded. He never expected to be remembered. They stood in the garage that evening, looking at an old Craftsman toolbox covered in oil stains and welded patches. The same kind Thompson had used in 1944 to drill holes in a Sherman turret by flashlight. Crawford pointed to it and smiled. That's the real monument. Thompson chuckled. Well, he said, it never made history. Just kept it going. When Crawford left that night, Thompson walked him to the car. Before getting in, Crawford hugged him tight, like he had back in France when the shooting stopped. You saved my life, he said. That's never going away. They never saw each other again. In 2003, after Thompson passed away, his daughters found the letters, faded, folded carefully in a cigar box. Along with them was a single 3x4-inch mirror in a rusted steel bracket. The wire was still wrapped tight at the corners. A note was taped to the back in handwriting that hadn't changed since the war. Original. Crawford's tank. September 18, 1944. Didn't think it mattered. Guess it did. The mirror now sits in a small display at the National Armor and Cavalry Museum in Georgia. No fanfare. No headline. Just a small plaque with a quiet truth. Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson, 4th Armored Division. Devised and installed the first gunner's mirror in a Sherman tank during World War II. An unauthorized field modification that became standard across U.S. armored units. Credited with saving hundreds of American tank crew lives. His name was almost forgotten, until one historian asked a simple question. Who put the mirror there? Thompson said he didn't need recognition. He had Crawford sitting in his garage alive. That's recognition enough. Frank Thompson died on March 14, 2003. He was 84 years old. Heart failure. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II as a tank crewman with 4th Armored Division. It did not mention the mirror modification. Did not mention that he'd saved hundreds of lives. Did not mention that he'd changed how American armor fought in Europe. His funeral was small. Family, a few friends. 3 men Thompson didn't know attended. They introduced themselves after the service. Tank veterans. Men whose crews had used the mirror modification. They'd read about Thompson's death in veterans' newsletters, wanted to pay respects, wanted his family to know what he'd done. Thompson's daughters learned the full story that day, learned their father had installed mirrors in tanks, learned those mirrors had saved lives, learned he'd done it without authorization, risking court-martial, learned he'd never talked about it because he didn't think it mattered. Today, Thompson's story exists in fragments, maintenance logs in the National Archives, interview transcripts in military history collections, a paragraph in a book about Sherman tank modifications. Most people who study World War II armor have never heard of him. The mirror modification is a footnote, a curiosity, not significant enough for textbooks. But if you visit the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, you can see a Sherman tank from 4th Armored Division. Inside the turret, mounted to the left of the gunner's seat, there's a small rectangular mirror, 3 x 4 metal frame, crude wire brackets. It's labeled as a field modification, common in late 1944. No name attached. That mirror is Thompson's legacy. Not the official one. The real one. The one that mattered to Crawford and Hayes and the 200 others who survived because a desperate loader broke regulations to save his crew. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or engineering teams. Through soldiers who see problems and fix them. Who don't wait for authorization. Who risk everything because their friends are dying and they can't stand watching anymore. Thompson installed the mirror to save Crawford. That mirror saved hundreds. And nobody remembers his name, but you do now.